everybody. Welcome to Your Money Map, sponsored by the Alliance for Lifetime Income. I'm your host, Jean Chatzky. I'm very glad to have all of you along with me today because we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics. We're going to talk about behavioral finance. And behavioral finance is often described as the intersection of money and psychology and decision-making processes of individuals and institutions and why they don't always happen the way that they should in real terms, in real life. It's the science of why smart people like all of us, sometimes make not so smart decisions with our money, and sometimes do that even when we know the right things to do, which can be frustrating, difficult to understand, especially if it's happening in your own life and playing out right before our eyes. Our guest today is Sarah Newcomb, and Sarah is one of my favorite behavioral economists. She's just amazing in the way that she puts things in plain English. She is a behavioral economist at Morningstar, where she works to integrate findings from the world of behavioral science into real life financial management applications for both individuals and financial advisors. She's also an author. Her book is Loaded: Money Psychology and How to Get Ahead Without Leaving Your Values Behind. I've read it. It's terrific. If you're looking for a great way to start your journey into behavioral finance, I would suggest that you pick it up, and I'm really happy to have her along with me today. Sarah, welcome. Nice to talk to you. Nice to see you, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jean. It's really great to be here.
So we are at a very interesting point, I think, in our economic life cycle. We're dealing with inflation at a 40-year high. We're dealing with prices that are rising, in some cases because companies have to increase them, in some cases because companies are finding that they can increase them, that consumers will stand for that. But as we look at the challenges of planning for retirement, how does that play into our thinking or our planning and how we should be laying out a roadmap for the future?
Mhm. Yeah, I think what we have to do, and this is, you'll probably hear me say this over and over, is in taking the long view. It is one of the hardest things for us to do as humans is to step back and look at the long view. But yes, we're seeing 40-year high inflation right now. But for the few years previous, we were seeing zero inflation. We were seeing really, really low inflation. And if you average it out over a long period of time, the historical averages may not actually change that much. If you look at historical averages of inflation in the US, it's somewhere around 3% annually. Over, it depends on what time frame you look at, right? But as just like with the stock market, same thing with the general economy, with inflation, the short term is really hard to predict. But the long term, that's where we see trends that we can usually bank on. And so if you're thinking about long-term planning, if you happen to have a long way to go until retirement, then what's happening right now may turn out to be fairly irrelevant.
Mm.
What we really need to do is average it over long term and say, okay, what is the effect? I'm not saying inflation is inconsequential because it's huge. Inflation matters a lot, and I think it matters a lot more than most people think it does. But people generally only think about inflation when we have these huge shocks, right? So I think this is a teachable moment because right now people are paying attention to inflation. A couple of years ago, they weren't. But inflation is constantly affecting our finances in ways that we're not thinking about.
What kind of ways? I mean, when you say inflation is always an impact, and it's an impact that people don't often consider, when we have I guess, a relatively average inflationary environment, when inflation sits where the Federal Reserve wants it to sit, 2 to 3%. Well, what does that do to our savings and our investments over time?
Yeah, so this is where I think it's so important. People talk about the time value of money, and it's such an abstract concept. But even when you do learn about the time value of money, you're probably taught about it in terms of interest on your, how your interest will grow and compound. But inflation has the same effect taking away from your money. So let me explain it. At 3% inflation, it doesn't feel like much, right? Something that would cost you a dollar today will cost $1.03 next year. That doesn't feel like much, 3%. But compounded over time, 3% inflation, here's a basic rule of thumb. At 3% inflation, prices double every 24 and a half years. So every 25 years, prices double. So that means then another 25 years, they double again. So in 50 years, they're 4 times what they were. So when you hear like your grandparents talking about getting a burger for a dime,
Right.
it's that is inflation, and it happens faster than we realize. We all sit there and go, I can't believe prices today. But it's the natural effect of inflation compounded over time. So here's where I think it affects us where we don't generally think about it. And it really affects us when it comes to retirement. People spend so much time and effort planning for that age 65 or 67, right? And they plan for day one of retirement, and they do this really good work of figuring out how much do I need in order to maintain the standard of living that I want in retirement. But they're thinking about day one of retirement. And that might have been adequate when we first started retiring, and we were retired for what, 5 years? So, before, and, life expectancy ran out. Now it's not uncommon for people to be in retirement for 25 years. So at 3% inflation, what does that mean? That means that when they're at the end of their lives, when they're at the least possible moment for them to go out and earn more money, everything costs double what it did when the day they retired. So you plan for this fixed income, but that fixed income literally kind of shrinks over time, and you get more and more uncomfortable as you age. And most of us are not thinking about that. But it's so important to think about.
Right. And I'm wondering what's the best way to actually encourage ourselves to think about this uncomfortable thing? Because as human beings, I've read enough about behavioral finance to know we're not very good at thinking about the future at all. We're particularly not good at thinking of the future that is very long term. I mean, as you were saying these examples, I'm 57 years old, right? So I'm doing some math in my head and I'm like, okay, well, prices are going to double between now and the time I'm in probably the heart of my retirement. And then if I live as long as my pop up did, and he lived to be 98 years old, they're almost going to double again,
Yeah.
which is, even when you're thinking not just about the cost of a car, but the cost of milk and eggs and a plane ticket and rent and healthcare,
Mhm.
that is a ton of money, and it's daunting.
Yeah, it can easily shut you down, right? Because you go, "Oh my god, I'm never going to be able to do it." And that's what happens to a lot of people. You start to face these realities, and it's overwhelming, and you just say, I can't deal with it. I guess I'm never retiring, or I don't know, I'll figure it out, right? And so we stick our head in the sand, and behavioral economists like to call that the ostrich effect. It really just means we don't like to face the truth. But here's one thing that you can do is, first of all, I think a really important thing for any saver or investor to understand when it comes to inflation, there's two things. But the first one is, your goal is not to beat the market. People get really caught up in, how do I invest so that I can beat the market? Your goal is not to beat the market. Your goal is to beat inflation. Consistently
Okay.
beat inflation, because what you want is for your money to grow faster than it's shrinking, because that way it's keeping up with the cost of living, and you want it to more than keep up with the cost of living while you're saving up. But then once you retire, as long as your money keeps growing at least at 3%, which isn't that hard to get, then you're going to be okay. What you can't do is just draw down, draw down, draw down. You have to keep your money growing, at least keep a portion of your money invested so that it can grow, so that that chunk of money that is creating that income for you so that your fixed income can actually increase a little bit over time. So you have to keep your money invested in retirement. You don't want to have it in super risky stuff, but you don't have to have it in super risky stuff to beat an average 3% inflation.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I know that some people get stuck on just trying to figure out if we're talking about this in two phases, right? We're talking about the accumulation phase for before we get to retirement, and then the actual making the money grow with inflation or as fast as inflation while we're in retirement, while providing enough money for us to live on. That's a couple of tough concepts to wrap our brains around.
Mhm.
I know that you have an exercise that you take people through to help them get a sense of how much they may actually spend in retirement, and that I think is helpful because it's a question that not enough people think about. And before you describe it, let me just remind everybody, you are watching Your Money Map. It's sponsored by the Alliance for Lifetime Income, and we'd love this to be an interactive conversation. And so if you've got questions for Sarah, just put them in the chat and I will happily pull them out and integrate them into the conversation.
Great. Yeah. So this question, this exercise, it's a thought exercise. And I was taught this lifetime ago when I was training to be a financial advisor. And it had a huge impact on me. And I've gone through this mental exercise several times as my life and priorities have changed. So it's not like a one and done, but it's a really great thing to do at any point. So what you want to do is you want to think, first of all, the one trick that you can do if you have a hard time picturing the future, and especially if you're like me and you naturally are a short-term thinker, kind of impatient, then the future is going to feel really unreal. It just feels like this, abstract, who knows, right? So one trick you can do is take a picture of your face and have it age progressed, so that
I've
you'd
done
see
this.
yourself. I have done it too, and it's a
Mhm.
little uncomfortable at first, but once you really look at it, you start to see like this person, I care about this person. Do I want this person to be financially stressed? No, I want this person to live with dignity. And this person is entirely dependent on the choices that I'm making. And so first of all, that can kind of kickstart you. It gives you that kick in the gut that makes you go, oh, the future is kind of a real thing. If when I make it to this age, do I still want to be struggling? No. So that's number one. Then what you can do is you picture a day in the life of this person. So now you've got a sense of what you're going to look like with a few more wrinkles and, maybe some whiter hair. And but there's a few things you want to do in detail, and this may take you 5 minutes, 10, maybe 15, right, depending on how deep you want to go with it. But what you want to do is you want to think from first person. So don't imagine that person as if you're watching them like in a dream state. You're watching yourself from over here. You want to imagine like in the morning you wake up, you open your eyes, you look around your room. You're 65, you're 70. What do you see? What room are you in? What does your room look like? Are you in a house or a condo or an apartment? Is it in a rural place? Is it in the city? Do you live with anybody else? Are you living alone? These things, when you go to your closet to get dressed, what do you see in there? And what you want to do is go through an entire day in the life of this person that you're now seeing, right? What does a really ideal but realistic
Mhm.
day in their life look like, including really specific things like where are you going to eat? Do you eat at home or do you want to be going out to restaurants? Are you living with others? Are you living in a city? Where's your family? Are your children living nearby or are you traveling a few times a year to see them? And so you go through this day, like how are you spending your time? You're not working. So what are you doing with your time? How are you filling your hours? How are you making your life fulfilling? And as you go through your day, your relationships, your hobbies, your life, you're going to find out things like what kind of car are you driving and how
Oh,
often are you traveling. And at the end of that day, when after you go to bed and you close your eyes, then you ask yourself, okay, you have a picture of this lifestyle now. Now, first of all, you're going to be a lot more emotionally connected and you're going to have a better sense of what it is you're really working toward once you've thought this through at that level of detail. And so that emotional connection can really help motivate savings. But second of all, what this really helps you do is then you need to ask yourself the question, if I lived that exact lifestyle today, how much would it cost me? What's
hmm.
the general ballpark of that lifestyle today? And if it's an $80,000 lifestyle, then you say, okay, great. Now that on day one of retirement, I want to live a lifestyle that would cost 80,000 today. And then you can go to Excel or an online calculator, and there's a little bit of math you need to do, but you don't have to be too intimidated. In Excel, it's called a future value calculation. And you can look up how to do it. And basically, all you need to do is you put in what the present value is. So in this case, we're saying this is an $80,000 a year lifestyle. So you would put in the present value. You'd put in your assumptions about the interest rate. In this case, the inflation rate. So we'll say 3% inflation, and then the number of years from now until retirement. And so if you're planning on retiring in 25 years at 3% inflation, that $80,000 a year lifestyle will cost you $160,000. So
Got it.
that's
And then from there, you can sort of back out what you need in your portfolio combined with what you're expecting from Social Security in order to produce this. And I like the idea of knowing of that $160,000, perhaps $100,000 is going to be a fixed cost, right? I need that money in order to make my Medicare premiums, in order to pay the homeowners association fees on my condo, because I am doing
Mhm.
this exercise in my head, Sarah, so I know
Yeah.
where I'm living, and but maybe the other 60,000 is variable, and so that's money that I'll just keep invested, but I might choose to cover a portion of it with a pension, which I'm fortunate enough to have, but another source of guaranteed income like an annuity.
Yep. And also you can go to Social Security and their website, and you can estimate how much your Social Security benefits will likely be. And so you can understand of that 160,000 that you're going to need, how much is already going to be provided for you and how much is up to you to find a way to fund. And so already it'll be a little less daunting. Um, but I think that it's the level of detail that most of us never do when we're thinking about the future. When we think about the future, we tend to think in broad strokes. Oh, I want to be happy. I want to be relaxed. Okay. But if you don't think about in detail what you actually want to do, first of all, you will not be emotionally connected to it. And the motivation to save for it is going to be much harder to muster, especially if you're a short term thinker. And secondly, you're not going to plan for a future you're not even thinking about.
Right. And sometimes I've found, because I think I'm somewhere in the middle of a short-term thinker and a long-term thinker. Sometimes I'm impetuous, but sometimes I do try to get myself to think longer term, but I also I do it with the help of my advisor, and my husband and I both sit down with our advisor, and we have these sorts of calculations, and we run, and Shilpa's asking a question about the calculation that you mentioned in Excel. What exactly is it called? It's a future value
Yeah, it's called a
calculation,
future
correct?
value calculation. And the inputs that you'll need are the present value, and that's your guesstimate of how much that lifestyle would cost today, and the interest rate, and that's your assumptions about the inflation rate, and then the number of periods, which is the number of years that you'll be seeing that inflation rate, and then it'll
Um,
do this for you.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because when we talk about this, what we're really talking about is a financial plan, and it's it is hard to get yourself to be that future thinker when you tend to be a little more short term. I'm wondering if you've noticed a difference in the pandemic, if you've noticed that during the pandemic, it's been even harder for people because there's been so much illness, because there's been so much death, and now we're in the middle, we're not, but the world is in the middle of a war. I mean, I'm sort of wondering if all of this chaos has made it even tougher to focus on the future.
It has. And I mean, I haven't seen studies yet because we just don't have enough time to have, looked at data yet, but it definitely has. Because what happens to us psychologically and cognitively is uncertainty. When things are uncertain, it shortens our mental time horizon because we are less certain of the future, and so we're less likely to plan for it. And what's happening right now with so much uncertainty, the pandemic, climate change, war, everything, you name it, there's this real Armageddon narrative that is caught on all over the place. And I'm hearing people that are normally long-term thinkers saying things like, I don't know what's going to be happening next year. And when you can't see past next month, you aren't likely to plan for a 20-year timeline because it feels very improbable. It feels like a lost cause. And we need to fight against the fact that it feels illogical, because it's actually very logical to still make a plan. We need to figure out, we need that middle path, right? We need to live for the moment and plan for the future. And it's something that we always have had to do in order to be good with money. But I think that the pandemic is really bringing it to the forefront for a lot of people. Another thing that's happening with the pandemic is that, you hear about the great resignation or the great reshuffling, right? This has been a period of intense reprioritizing for people. There's been a big collective, we're all sort of having this existential crisis at the same time, which makes it really interesting. But also, it's what's happening is that we're looking and saying, what do I want to be spending my time with or doing, right? What is really important to me? And that's a really good thing to be thinking about. And that's the part of, how do I live for today? How do I make sure that whatever time I have left, I spend it well? And that's what we always, you always have to think that way anyway, because we never know how much time we have. But we don't know how short our time is, but we don't know how long our time is going to be. And that's the thing, I think, is life is very short, but life is also very long. And we need to plan for both.
You mentioned that you are a short-term thinker naturally, right? That's your natural way of being. And yet I know you're a planner. So how did you make the switch? How did you get yourself to become to behave differently? Because this is really about behavior.
It is. But I believe that your behavior won't change until your mind changes. That our thinking is the root of our behavior. And so you can try to force new behavior, but it's not going to stick if you're still thinking the same way. And so through my work, I became really convinced that there is a very strong link between how far ahead you think and plan, and how much, what I've seen is that people who think farther ahead have more assets, and they save more, they spend less, they are more peaceful about their finances, they make better long-term decisions because they're thinking about the long term. And what I saw was, like, when I ask people in surveys, how far ahead do you tend to think and plan, I give them different categories: days, weeks, months, years, decades, or generations. Right?
Where do people tend to land?
Most people, like 70% of people, whenever I do this survey, are at years or fewer. So you only have about 30% of people in any group that I've tested that think decades or generations ahead. But to be planning for retirement, you need to think decades or generations ahead. This is just not natural for us. It's natural for finance professionals because we get taught to do that. But for the
Right.
general person, you're thinking a couple years ahead at most. And you've got, so first of all, I became convinced that that was the key, that the fact that I couldn't think and see the future beyond a couple years ahead was what was at the root of what was holding me back. I mean, think about it. It affects every part of your life. Think about a person who thinks weeks ahead and then a person who thinks decades ahead. And just imagine the investment decisions they're going to make. Which
Right.
one's more likely to take major risks to try to get rich fast? Because if you only think weeks ahead, you want to return as fast as possible because the future doesn't feel real. Short-term thinking and impulsiveness and impatience are linked. And so that is the root of my financial issues. So I learned I had to force my mind into the future. And so it's hard, just like any habit of behavior is hard to change. Habits of mind are hard to change, but I think habits of mind are easier to change, and then the behaviors come naturally. So I age progressed my face and I put the picture on the wall and I started to think about the future. And I'll tell you, I, at my gut, started to get desperate to save. And now I'm a super saver. And
Yeah.
it was something I had to practice over time, but I had to change my mind first. And then the behavior changed.
Well, and for me, I think, look, I started to become a super saver when I got divorced, right? And it was just I turned 40, I got divorced, my father passed away. It was just an overall shock to the system, right? And that was the switch that flipped, that made me,
Mhm.
I was always a decent saver, but it made me a super saver. But the other thing that really helped is just tapping into the technology that is there
Mhm.
to save you in your weaker moments.
Oh,
So
for sure.
I still save automatically for every single goal I have because that's how I know that I'm going to do it.
Yep. Automation is a lifesaver. It is the reason why my credit score is great now because all my bills are paid on time. I don't have to think about that. When you have enough stability that you can automate, start to get really smooth. Now, if you're not at a point where you have enough stability to automate, this is the hard part, is getting to that point of stability, because when things are really tight, you can't afford to make mistakes and you can't necessarily plan ahead because you have to watch every dollar and every paycheck. So for a while, you've got to watch it like a hawk. But if you can only think 2 weeks ahead, don't try to think 40 years ahead right now. Just try to think a month ahead. And
Yeah.
then once you can get to a month, then you start to go, great. Now I'm thinking a month ahead. Now I'm going to go to 3 months. And then you start to build stability. And once you build stability, then you can build really long-term growth on top of that. But that long-term growth has got to be built on a baseline of stability. And so baby steps. If you're thinking weeks, just try months. If you're thinking months, just try years. If you're thinking years, try decades, and so on. But you
We're,
won't build generational wealth if you're thinking weeks ahead. You just
we're,
won't.
we're getting some great questions and some great comments. So I want to bring this into the conversation. Nikesha, and I hope I didn't mispronounce that. I'm sorry if I did, said that she also started focusing on her savings after divorce. Diane points out she cannot sleep unless she has 3 years of saved salary saved so that she can protect her boundaries. Um, Libby says, I'm currently 30 and I'm focused on decades ahead, but only after watching my own father, very young, suffer a series of devastating strokes in his early 50s. It took something drastic and very sad in order to kick her into gear. And I think that does sometimes happen.
It does. And I mean, you mentioning divorce and your father, I mean, those are things that get you thinking long term, that get you thinking about mortality. And I mean, we can't avoid the fact that we're planning for a lifetime, which involves death. And I think that part of good money management is facing some tough stuff and not running away from it. And when the number looks scary, rather than saying, oh my God, I can't do it, you go, okay, how am I going to do this? And there are ways. And you talked about a financial plan, and what we're talking about is financial planning. And this is the thing I think people don't get about financial planning. A lot of people think that financial planning is about putting together an investment portfolio. And that's a part of it. But what a financial plan is you say, it's saying, here's where I am now, here's where I want to be by the future. Now, what are the steps I'm going to take to get from here to there? How am I going to, I want to set up my dream. And that's why you want to picture the dream first. What is your dream? And then once you have your dream, then you mobilize your resources to support getting to the dream. And once you make that plan, even though you know it's going to change because life is going to change it, once you have that plan, then even if the number is daunting, you know you're on the way to get there. You know how you're going to get there. You know how you're going to mobilize not just your investment portfolio, but any property you may own, your human capital, things like that. How are you using all the ways you have to earn money? You've got 3 ways to earn money: land, labor, and capital. Right?
Yeah.
If you ever want to stop laboring, you need to have land and capital. And it's as simple as that.
I actually was going to ask about real estate because, particularly now, a mortgage seems like a very nice hedge against inflation, right? I'm sitting in my daughter's apartment in New York City where rents are just going up, up, up faster than the unfortunate people renting those apartments can count. And if you've got a mortgage payment, particularly if you have a mortgage payment that you locked into last year or the year before when interest rates were still low, you are somewhat protected.
Mhm.
Where do you see real estate in the context of a person's financial plan?
I think it can be a really, really good addition. Think about how, in your investments, you want to diversify. I think in your income streams, you want to diversify. So again, you got 3 ways. Why not make income come from all 3? Why not have labor income, land income, and capital income while you're building up your assets? Real estate can be great in that if you become a landowner, then you have, in a sense, inflation protected income because as costs of living go up, you can raise the rents accordingly unless you're in a rent controlled area. But caveat is that real estate also comes with a lot of physical property, comes with a lot of caretaking and maintenance. And if you don't continue to invest in it, it will stop being an asset and it will start being a liability. And so if you don't have the extra buffer, if you're not planning for, you need to plan for not just your mortgage and your insurance, you need to plan upkeep and maintenance and all of that. And so when you're planning on using property for income, you have to understand what you're getting into. But I think it can be a great way to diversify your income streams. And like you said, it's in the payments are inflation protected because as the cost of living goes up, if you have a fixed rate mortgage, essentially the cost of your mortgage is going down because it's staying the same while the cost of everything is going up. So there are some really great reasons to own real estate. I think it gets people feel like it's either the only way to wealth or it's the worst. It's not. It's neither. It's how you use it, and it can be a really great income stream.
Diana's asking for a quick clarification. You said labor, you said land, and you said capital, correct?
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah,
third
so this is
one.
from basic economics. There are 3 factors of production: land, labor, and capital. And we all know, we're all familiar with labor as a source of income. Some people are actually lucky enough to be born with land and capital. Labor is your human capital. It's what you go out and you rent your skills, your time, your energy, your intelligence to someone else, and they pay you for it. But you are generating that wealth. It's not coming from them, it's coming from you. So your human capital is something you can develop, you can invest in through education and skill development. You can make it more valuable in the marketplace. So optimizing your human capital is one really great way to increase your income streams. Land is real estate, any kind of thing. So land can be, think about all the ways you can make money from land. You can farm it, you can mine it, you can develop it, you can rent it, you can sell it. There's lots of different ways to make income from land, physical property. And then capital is basically everything else. There's financial capital and physical capital. It's all the things that have value. So Capital is, if you have a tractor, that's physical capital. You could rent that out by the hour, or you could use it to develop your land. The capital is the things that we employ. But all these are the three categories of things that have value in the marketplace. And so the way that when I realized, oh, if we ever want to take labor out of the equation, you have to have income coming from the other two. So you have to have land and or capital to cover the cost, or to cover the income that would have been coming from your labor. So in order to reach financial independence, even most of us don't start with land and capital. Most of us only start with labor. That's our only means of income. And so if you want to build up to a diverse income stream and financial independence, then what you've got to do is take some of what's coming from your income and invest in capital and land. And then as these start to make money, you reinvest until they're making enough money that you don't need this anymore. And that is the path. That's a financial plan.
Right? That's a path to financial independence. One of the things that makes it a little bit rocky is market volatility. And as we have been watching the markets, particularly over the past couple of months, they've been incredibly volatile, and not just the stock market, but the bond markets have really been through it.
Mhm.
What do you say from a behavioral standpoint is the best way to weather these swings that want to make us shut our eyes?
Yeah. I was going to say, I said at the beginning that I'd say this a couple times, so I'm going to say it again. You got to back up and take the long view, right? Think about, when is it that you are planning on selling these assets? If it's 20 years from now, it doesn't matter what they're selling for today. You're not selling them today. The only thing
Right.
you need to think about is, when do you need to sell them? And if you're a long way off from that, you've got plenty of time. The market is, I mean, if you look at long-term market trends, you see it go like this. And I love these things where they zoom in and it looks really crazy, and then they zoom out and you see that actually that was just a dip on this upward path. And so I think, again, you got to see the big picture. We need to zoom into the future and zoom out from the present. We've got to find that middle view where we're not so focused on what's happening right now that we get so emotional, and we're not so distant from the future that we're not emotionally connected. We've got to, it's the wise mind. It's that
Yeah.
middle way of thinking about it. I see a comment here that I'd really like to address.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
So Diane Terry, who says, I cannot sleep unless I have 3 years of salary saved so I can protect my boundaries. I love the protecting your boundaries. I love knowing that you want, your freedom is the most important thing to you, your autonomy in your life. But I think what it brings up is that there is such a thing as an oversaver. And
Mhm.
there is, just like not thinking into the future enough. I'm not saying 3 years is too much. I think 3 years is great. It's wonderful. But the topic of how much is too much, I think is
Well,
an
and
important.
Shilpa asked on a related note, like, what is a super saver, and should you aim to be one, or is it too much?
Yeah. So I do have some thoughts on this. And I think, again, what we're looking at is any of the extremes are unhealthy. The point here is that we want to have a healthy relationship with our money, and we want to be thinking in healthy ways about our resource management. We don't want to be driven by our emotions, and yet we want our money to help us live our best life, which is inherently emotional. So, what we need to do is think about protecting against planning for the future, and protecting against sort of the known unknowns, right? We know that things will come up, the car will break down, the furnace will blow, the house will need a new roof, somebody's going to get sick. We know these things will happen, and that's why we save, and that's why we buy insurance. But then there are many people who start to acquire wealth, and many people who have more money than they can realistically ever spend, and yet they still can't sleep at night.
Mhm.
And that is also not healthy financially, because if you're not enjoying the peace of mind that financial security is bringing, then it's not actually giving you what we want it for. And so there's the other extreme from short-term thinkers, which is people who are what ifing themselves into anxiety. And if so, this tends to be people who are already thinking long term. They're thinking the long term. They're planning for the future. But when they look into the future, all they see is all the things that could go wrong and all the things they can't control. And I'll tell you, there is no number that's going to make you feel safe if you are imagining doomsday. There's just
Right.
no number that can compete with your own imagination.
We see this with women a lot. We call it bag lady syndrome, right? And we just fielded some research. Her Money and the Alliance for Lifetime Income worked together on a new study where we saw it again. Very high earning women with substantial assets worry a lot
Yeah.
more than you
And
would expect.
it's
So, how
and
do
I
we
think
shut that down?
well, I think first of all, you got to honor where it's coming from. You're wanting security and you're wanting that generation. You want to make your next generation stable. It's coming from a great place. And so this isn't like, these aren't character flaws. There's no shame here in either one of these things. But I think that what we need to do is recognize, first of all, that there is no number. You got to admit there's no number that's going to be able to compete with your imagination, because any number you come up with, you can come up with a scenario that's not enough. And so stop trying to reach a number that's going to make you feel good, because you're not going to find it if this is where you're at. What you need to do instead is two things. Number one, focus on the things that you can control, not the things that are out of your control, because there are many things that you will never be able to control. And yes, some of them might happen.
Yeah.
So we hedge against disaster. We plan for the worst case scenario. We buy. That's what insurance is for. That's what long-term care is for. That's what there are resources out there to help you plan for a lot of the what ifs. But if you're what ifing yourself to death, what you've got to learn how to do is turn the what if into a so what.
Mm.
And the way you do that is you face the what if. You say, okay, like when I first started earning a real income, I had more money than I had thought I would ever have. And I started to get really stressed, because what would happen if it all went away? What would
Yeah.
happen if I didn't have it anymore? What would that mean about me? What would that mean about, would I still belong?
Yeah.
I'm in the finance industry. What would that mean? Right? And so these fears started to creep in. And I realized, okay, what would I do if suddenly it all went away? And I realized realistically, I would probably move in with my mom, and it would not be that bad. And I would spend some great time with my mother in her golden years, and I would rebuild. And when you actually start to look at it, you see that the worst case scenario isn't actually the end of the story. There would be some grieving, there would be some transition, but I think one of the best things you can do is to answer the question, if all of a sudden I had no money, who would still love me?
Mm.
Because we worry about losing belonging. We
Yeah.
worry about losing our place in the world. And when you know that even if the worst happened, you'd still have some people, it really, really does help. And there has been some research around this, that it's our social support network that helps us to get out of rumination when we're
100%. Sarah, you're amazing. Thank you so much for this conversation. We've had a couple of people asking if they'll be able to watch this back again. We'll post it on our Facebook channels, but of course, you can always go to protectedincome.org, which is the Alliance for Lifetime Income's website. /Newcomb is where you'll find this conversation because that's Sarah's last name. Where can we find more of your wonderful work?
I am on Twitter at finance_therapy. And my book Loaded is on Wiley and Amazon and wherever else. So if you just look up Sarah Newcomb Loaded, that was a labor of love. I love that it's out there in the world for people. So that's
Yeah.
probably the best way.
Fantastic. And I hope to see you again soon. And thank you guys for the comments. This was a great discussion. Loved having everybody participate. We'll be back again in 2 weeks. And so I hope that you'll tune in again then. Sarah, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.